arrive at the second special talk of this conference. Please join me in welcoming Shri Halley Kalyan, an independent researcher in Indian knowledge systems. Halley ji holds a BTech in computer science from IIT Hyderabad and an MBA from IIM Lucknow. While his professional life is rooted in the world of technology, his intellectual and spiritual pursuits are deeply engaged with Sanatan Dharma. Halley ji describes himself as an inquisitive Hindu trying to understand Sanatan Dharma. His areas of interest span modernity, tradition, continuity, as well as intersections like religion, ecology, economics, and technology society. He shares his reflections and talks widely. He's presented at one of INDICA's events earlier, and his talks are also available on Atharva Foundation's channel. I request our Kulapati Nagaraj Paturi Garu to felicitate Halley ji. Thank you, Nagaraj. Today, Halley ji will present a talk that invites us to revisit the literary contributions of a towering Telugu literary figure, Shri Viswanatha Satyanarayana, and explore how his writings can serve as a tool to understand Bharatiya Jñāna Paramparā. Halley ji, the stage is all yours.
Namaste everyone. Thanks to INDICA for having me here, and thanks especially to Dr. Nagaraj Paturi Garu for inviting me for this talk. And we just had a brief conversation on some of the themes that were there as a part of this conference, and there was this one on literature and decolonization. And it was in that context that we thought Viswanatha Satyanarayana's work will be very helpful. And instead of using decolonization itself as the word, I think I wanted to focus more on how Viswanatha Satyanarayana's literature will be helpful to understand and connect with Bharatiya Jñāna Paramparā, and broadly to understand what Bharatiyata really means. So I think that's the theme that I'd like to focus on today. Okay. So just a very quick introduction to Kavi-Samrat Viswanatha Satyanarayana's background, because not everybody may be aware of him. Those from the Telugu spaces might be aware, but others may not be. So Viswanatha Satyanarayana was born 1895, and he was here till 1976. So pretty much he covered that colonial epoch, and he produced a huge corpus of work. So his published works are 100 plus, and 60 to 70 odd novels, plays, and critical essays. And there is also this magnum opus of his, an epic Ramayana Kalpavruksham, for which he got the Gnanpith in 1970. And he also got the Padma Bhushan award. So he's pretty much like a well-recognized literary giant in the Telugu spaces. And his work, Veyi Padagalu, was also translated into Hindi by our ex-Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao Garu as śāstra. So that's also again a very widely acclaimed work. And what I'll try to do today is, I am not going to get into each one of those works. Obviously, talking about 100 plus works on a stage like this in 40 minutes it's not possible. But as I said, I'll try to touch upon those aspects which are relevant for this broad IKS or Bharatiya Jñāna Paramparā space, and also in terms of what Bharatiyata really means. So, as I said, I think Viswanatha Satyanarayana's lifetime was very peculiar, because that was when the colonial epoch was pretty much at its peak, and then we had the partition, then the independent India, the constitution came up, then India became a republic and all of that. So his works, particularly those he has written as a socio-political commentary, they cover this entire phase. And that is broadly the area that I'd like to touch upon today. So when we talk about that colonial epoch, we identify that there was this English or Portuguese and all of this, we had a slew of colonizers who have come into India, conquered us, and then they left us. So we have this picture of who a colonizer is, and then we have a picture of who a freedom is. But when Viswanatha Satyanarayana is talking about Bharatiyata and talking about dharma and the whole Jnana Parampara, he is not necessarily referring to that one particular instance of an external conqueror or a foreigner conqueror coming into India. So the way he defines it in one of his essays is that you have this conception of a nagarikata or a nagarikata, which is civilization. So that there is a civilization that is built on values like ahimsa, daya, dana, dharma. So that is one kind of a civilization. And then you have another civilization which is built on this idea of colonizing, looting, violence, and trying to impose your culture on others. So this, he says, is like an endless struggle. It's like a Devasura Sangrama kind of thing that keeps happening all the time. So while in his lifetime, in that particular instance, he might have written about the British colonization, but broadly speaking, his intent was to capture about these clash of values and clash of civilization, and more of it as an endless struggle. So in fact, he has written a big corpus of works called purāṇa Vaira Grandhamala, which kind of takes you back to the Puranic lore and keeps on pointing out these conflict in values and conflicting situations, and how we won over those, or how dharma played in the end, and how it persisted. So I think that's the way I'd like to put Viswanatha Satyanarayana's work in the broad decolonization space. It is not necessarily about one particular colonizer, it is broadly about this clash of civilizational values, and how this played out again and again through the course of our history. So here there is one particular writing of his where he sort of identifies what is it that changed with the colonial epoch that happened in the 18th to 19th century. So he talks about like broadly three themes, and most of those three themes have been touched upon broadly in the like the proceedings we've had here in this conference in the past 2 days. So the first one he says is Angleya Samparkamu. Angleya Samparkamu essentially means your interface with the English. And then he talks about Prakriti Śāstra Parishodhana, which means broadly the scientific method, enlightenment science, and how it gets applied to various spheres of life. And then he talks about Samyavad. So Samyavad again is not just state socialism, it is about socialistic sort of thinking. So it is mostly about the enlightenment ideas and equality, and how you start to look at everything else in your past from the equality lens. So he says that it is these three things that have affected us a lot more in this particular epoch compared to everything else that happened in the past. So when we talk about Angleya Samparkamu, which means our interface with English and then how it impacted us, first of course is language. Like I am speaking in English, a lot of us are speaking in English now because English has become the link language for this country now for various reasons. And then he talks about that, of how language is a vehicle of the values of that particular jati, and how English may not even have words to express a lot of those things that we hold ourselves dear as a culture and as a tradition. And then he also talks about how this whole transition happened because livelihood started being dictated by whoever knows English, whoever understands English, whoever grew up from that education system. They started getting the, let's say, the white collar jobs, the plushy jobs, and that sort of that was sort of by design by the colonial masters, and then we continued like that. So he speaks about that, and then he emphasizes a lot on that. If you want to really renew and connect again to the Bharatiya Jñāna Paramparā, you cannot just rely on English, and he keeps emphasizing on the value of the Indian languages. Particularly in his context, he keeps emphasizing on Telugu. And then of course he doesn't diverse Telugu and Sanskrit. So it is Telugu and Sanskrit that he talks about from his context. So broadly, I think for all the other people from other states, everybody has their own mother tongue, and then of course Sanskrit. So he talks about that whole language politics. And in one of his books like Veyi Padagalu, which I just mentioned, that P.V. Narasimha Rao translated it to Hindi. In that book, he has this one line which says, Bhasha Jati Yokka Ayu Pattu. Ayu is life-giving force. So he says that language is the life-giving force for that particular jati. So for us, if we start more and more like adopting to English, then we are essentially divorcing ourselves away from the life-giving force of our own tradition. So that's like one line of discourse that you would find in his works, where there's a lot of emphasis on why you being connected to your own language is important. You have to engage with your language, you have to learn it in the proper way, you should be able to cite scholars there, and you should have a viewpoint there. So there's a lot of emphasis he puts on language. And there he says that, let's say if you take some of these concepts that we're all familiar of as practicing Hindus, right? There's this thing called karma, there is this thing called prarabdha, there is Janma, we have Devatas, and we also have this notion of Atma being all pervading, like we can see it in a tree, we can see it in water, we can see it even in a mountain, for example. So he says that these bhavas have pervaded so much into the Indian languages, you cannot find this in a foreign language. So if you go to English, and now if I want to translate the word prarabdha to English, I really don't know what to call it. So that's the whole non-translatable sort of a challenge that we have. When you leave one language and go to another language, you also lose a lot of these cultural continuities and meanings and concepts that are so deeply enmeshed into your language that are not present in the other one. So that's one. And then talking about the Prakriti Shastra Parishodhana, which means essentially the change in the approach. So the broad scientific revolution that happened 16th, 17th century onwards, it influenced a lot. It created new methods of understanding the world around you. So there is the scientific method, there's a historical method, and all of that came along. So here he says that this particular method that came in, incidentally that also came in English, and it started influencing pretty much every sphere of our dharmic life. And he says that one of the biggest lacunae of this particular method is that it kind of rejects or is non-committal about 4 or 5 key areas. So he talks about adhyātmikam, daivikam, antaram, atindriyam, which is essentially adhyātmikata is something that we all have an intuitive understanding. So it's a spiritual world. And then there is daivikam, which is the world of your devas and devatas. And there is antaram, which is your inner world. And atindriyam, which is the world which is beyond your 5 senses. So he says that by trying to deploy the scientific method into anything and everything, and that method itself is non-committal or agnostic to all of these different spheres, which are also important for human life, we are paying a huge cost. So he criticizes this idea of trying to apply the scientific method in anything and everything, and particularly in terms of understanding our ways of life, understanding our past, and trying to design social systems based on that, so on. So I think when we are talking about Bharatiya Jñāna Paramparā or the IKS broadly, we need to also be cognizant about these methods that we are trying to deploy. So like Advait was just talking about the Western knowledge system versus Indian knowledge system. So some of this is relevant to that. And then he talks about Samyavadam. So the Samyavadam here, like I said, is not really about state socialism. It is more about how this whole discourse of all humans are equal, or equality sort of it became the overarching ideal based on which we start to analyze everything else in our sense of past. And this, he says, is very distinct with the colonial epoch, which never happened at this intensity in the past. Where what happens now is when somebody is trying to write their history, they try to deploy this method. So anything that satisfies that rubric of equality is acknowledged as good. Anything that goes even remotely against it, that is called as bad, it should be discarded, and so on. So what he says is that this method, it sort of created this kind of a conflict or a sense of revolt in a lot of us Hindus, that we started cultivating this kind of a disdain for our past. And this, he says, is very unique to this particular epoch, that this happening en masse to the education system, and this happening in this particular way where we distort our own past, or we stop talking about them, and we try to secularize our curriculum. So this, he says, is a very unique colonial epoch phenomenon. And then he talks about how you start reading the European constructs into your own past. Like typically these days it's very popular for people to refer to our past also as feudal past. Now that's a question we need to ask, that why do you call it feudal past? Did you have feudalism here? Who is the feud? Who is the serf? And all of that, right? So this again is coming because you tend to read the European, Europe has a stages of history kind of a narrative which Marx and others also have popularized. So you tend to see that, okay, if they had that, perhaps what we have here is also an equivalent of the same. So you start to look at that. And so if they have a certain kind of a conflict with the clergy there, you try to implicate that to the Brahmins here. So these are all things that Viswanatha Satyanarayana writes about, saying that you know about the clergy there and you try to superimpose that concept onto the Brahmins here, and then that has an implication on how like the downstream effects basically. So he talks about this, that this has been a big change in this particular epoch. And then even if you, let's say, start reading the Ramayana, for example, there are narratives, I mean, some of us are familiar with the kind of narratives that come from down south, where they start to say Ravana is the hero and Rama is the villain. Rama was the one who came from north. So they try to start reading all of these Aryan Dravidian sort of hypotheses into these epics. So Viswanatha Satyanarayana says that this sort of things is all, it's a very puzzling thing that happened with the colonial epoch, because the methods and the way in which you start to look at your own past, that has changed. So when we are talking about trying to renew ourselves or reconnect ourselves into a Bharatiya Jñāna Paramparā, we'll also have to confront all of this. It's not going to be like a smooth journey. We'll also have to confront into all of these distortions into how we look at our own past. So in terms of literature specifically, so he's written a lot of content which maybe today can be called in the genre of literary criticism, in terms of how to understand literature, what is the purpose of literature and all of that. So there again, there's a lot of emphasis he tries to draw between why Bharatiya Sahitya or our Saraswatam, which is the overall corpus, is different from the Western. So he talks about Rasa, which is like Navarasa is something everybody knows. So he talks about how Rasa is something that is very distinct to our kavyas and our literature, which doesn't exist in the in the Western or European construct. And then he emphasizes on that. And he connects these both by saying that the current generation, so he's writing, let's say in the 50s and 60s in the last century, the Kavya Patanam, which means reading kavyas and reading purāṇas and all of that of that in that era, that has reduced because this scientific method and this Samyavada sort of a drikpadam has built this sort of a revolting, or you have this feeling that my past is outdated or it was evil or I need to reform sort of all this. So because your kavyas were reflecting the Sangha Vyavastha of that past, the hate for the Sangha and the hate for that your old social moorings, that translated into your literature also. So you abandon your literature because that literature is reflecting these outdated values or these values that you don't subscribe to now. And then he criticizes that, saying that you don't apply the same yardstick to when you are reading, let's say, a Shakespeare or a Milton or Aristotle or Plato or any of that. It is not like their society was also exactly the same as how it is today. But then you apply a different yardstick there, and there you say that let me at least appreciate the literary quality, or let me appreciate the broad message that he is trying to convey, so on. So there is this distinction where when you are looking at outside, you are okay with reading the classics, you are okay with even specializing in those classics. But when you are talking about your own sources, you have this whole disdain that has been built. So he makes this very interesting remark that what the colonial epoch did was that it not only built this Vaimukyamu, which means Vimukata, that you are like you have an indifference or some sort of a bare bones disdain kind of thing. It also built this what he called as a Pratikriya Bhavam, which means you want to actively sabotage your own past, your own traditions. So it built this, it sort of made us rebellions on our own tradition. So we want to sabotage our own traditions because this whole disdain and this whole hate has been manufactured very structuredly in, let's say, about 50-60 years of education. So many of us have become like this, where we are not just comfortable with being indifferent to it or not reading it. We want to actually distort it. We want to destroy it. We want to make sure that the next generation also hates it and it doesn't continue. So this sort of a pratikriya sort of a feeling is something that he criticizes a lot. That he says this is by design and it is not something that happened by accident. And that's where he says that when we are talking about a Swatantra Bharata or when we are talking about an independent India, what good is that independent India if you are not changing any of this? Then you are going to just produce more and more of these people who have this pratikriya avesham on their own traditions. And I think he wrote this, let's say, in 50s, 60s, and broadly I don't think we have done enough to correct that pratikriya sort of a mode, or even a vimukata sort of a mode. And perhaps this current era where we are talking about IKS, that will maybe do something to correct that vimukata and pratikriya emotions that have been built up over the years in this alien education system. So that is something that Viswanatha talks about a lot. And then talking about the Bhasha and all of this, he's also, it's not a very like a gloomy, dark kind of a picture. He also says this, that no matter what you do, no matter what the conqueror tries to do or what the colonizer tries to do, there is always this thing called a Jiva Shakti, which means there is this jiva that is tied up to this samskriti and to this dharma. And he says that jiva shakti will always hold on to something about that tradition. So you can always tap onto that, and that root will always, there is always this hope that it will eventually flower and flourish again. So he says that so long as that is retained in each of us, there is always hope. So I think that's again something that he emphasizes a lot. And then there's also this other difference that he points out in terms of how the society changed then to now. So he talks about this in multiple of his works. He talks about this word called subhiksha. So subhiksha is something that some of us are familiar with. Essentially, bhiksha is the sacred offering that we make to people who they may be artists, they may be priests, they may be performing something, and this is something you offer in return. So they do a sacred obligation, and you do this as your sacred obligation in return. So he says that the Bharatiya Samaj was essentially a Samaj where subhiksha was taken for granted, which means everybody has the capacity to do a bhiksha, and there was always somebody on the other side who was performing a sacred obligation to take this bhiksha. So that was a Samaj which was operating on this ideal of a subhiksha. And then he says that in this transition where a lot of these vrittis have gone, a lot of these traditions have broken, and we modernized, we moved more and more to this ideal of a udyogam. So from subhiksha, we became a su-udyogam society. Su-udyogam is essentially where everybody is clamoring for jobs and everybody is looking for livelihoods. And in this process also, he laments this fact that a lot of these sanchara jatis, which were essentially doing this, like they were like traveling universities pretty much, they were doing the job of educating people into our epics, into purāṇas, into dharma and all of that. That institution also got destroyed. So when we talk about knowledge systems and Jnāna Paramparā, it's also not just like a very textual or very Brahmanical kind of a notion. It is also about all of these traditions, which today somebody may call a subaltern tradition. These are also equal part or equal stakeholders in the whole dharmic corpus. Now interestingly, those who today try to weaponize these things as subaltern Hindutva versus Brahmanical Hindutva, they also don't pay enough attention to these loss of knowledge traditions. So while we may say that, let's say, I don't like those traditions because they are hereditary, we should at least make alternative institutional arrangements so that the knowledge traditions continue. But neither have we done that. So Viswanatha Satyanarayana's criticism really is that you have lost the knowledge, you have lost those knowledge traditions also. So what is it that you have really managed to survive, or what is it that you have managed to perpetuate? There's nothing to be proud of when you are losing all of this. So he actually makes a very strong remark that this kind of destruction of Vidya is much more worse than destructing a purāṇa, which means killing a person is also okay, but killing a Vidya is like exponentially bad. So that's the way he sees it. And it's very clear that we over the years, in the like 75 years of independent India, we have in fact lost a lot of these knowledge traditions, and a lot of us don't even acknowledge that they exist. So people like Viswanatha Satyanarayana, although they are portrayed as let's say those who are subscribing to a particular Brahmanical version of India and all of that, these are not like that. They were people who are acutely aware of how tradition operated on the ground, and they were equally defensive and equally protective about all the traditional knowledge traditions, be it performative arts, be it Kula Purāṇa narrators and all of that. So that's the sort of holistic picture that somebody like Viswanatha Satyanarayana had. And I think that is important to understand in the context of this whole Bharatiya Jñāna Paramparā discussion. So again, when we talk about the Jñāna Paramparā, there's always this question of, but what does it actually mean? So Viswanatha Satyanarayana is not somebody who escapes from those definitions. So he was very clear that our Saraswatam, which means our overall corpus, it is Vedanuyayi, which means it's Vedic, innately Vedic. So it's a Vedic tradition. So he is not saying Vedic is also one, non-Vedic is also fine, this is fine, that is fine, so on. He is acknowledging that it all like kind of stems from that particular sacred tree of the Vedic corpus. So it's all coming from there. And then he tries to differentiate between that and how the Western knowledge systems kind of emerge. So he says they are more human reason driven while we are Veda driven. So we are not saying that we'll keep discovering everything new on these matters every next generation. But in the West, it is not like that. In the 16th century, like maybe 2-3 philosophers will come. So Advait was talking about Spencer, for example. So some philosopher will come, he'll change a few things. 50 years later, another philosopher will come, he'll change a few things. But that's not how our traditions operated. So it was not dependent on human reason, it was not dependent on a philosopher. It was dependent on this sort of on overall Anadi Apaurushaya Ananta sort of a construct that we had on Veda, and that was the one that was coming downstream and impacting every other knowledge system. So it was not like an either or. That was the one which was really the life-giving force of various other knowledge systems that were surviving in our society. And that is the difference that Viswanatha tries to draw, that we moved away from this system and we are now trying to adopt to this human reason and philosopher sort of model, which is essentially not us. And then there is another novel of his which I think is very relevant to this context. That's called the Vallabha Mantri. So Vallabha Mantri is essentially, it's an allegorical work one can say. Vallabha Mantri is essentially Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. It's a book written about 3 fictional kingdoms. So there is a kingdom that is getting partitioned. One is essentially like the Pakistan of 1947, and then there is of course India. Then the third actor is the colonial actor. So there is a lot of that happens there. Although it's fictional, the parallels are like quite obvious that we need not shy away from stating those. So here he says that what has essentially happened in this transition is that we got stuck with what he says that paradinamaina jatiki bhava paradinata untundi. Bhava paradinata essentially is you are colonized in terms of your thoughts. So although you might feel like the external freedom has come to you, like the British colonizer left and then the Indians, let's say, took over control, the bhava paradinata is something that remained, which means the way of your thinking is still based on the same education system that the colonizer left there. So that is where he talks about, it's like pretty much like Vallabhbhai Patel. This novel is written in like 1950 to 60, that time period. So it's when the partition happened, the constitution got created, and this whole thing, or the constitutional India sort of emerged, the republic emerged. So here the novel ends with Vallabhbhai Patel, the character Vallabha Mantri, essentially saying that it felt like I have won, but I have really not won. What has come as freedom is essentially only the external, maybe the economic freedom we have come. We may have had some heavy industries, we may have gotten some economic independence, but our innate selves are still dictated by the same system that the colonizer left to us, and we are essentially still colonized. We don't have the Swatantram in the Antara sense, which is the inner self. So some of you may be aware of K.C. Bhattacharya's Swaraj in Ideas lecture, which is quite popular in the IKS space. So that's essentially what Vallabhbhai Patel was lamenting in the 50s. So that's the context of this novel, where it is like we felt we were independent, but are we really independent kind of thing. So when we are talking about, again, IKS and Bharatiya Jñāna Paramparā, all of these questions come back to us, that although we are independent, are we really independent? What does it mean to be independent? So on. So I'd like to also touch upon one particular aspect here, which keeps coming. It's like a consistently recurring theme in all of these IKS kind of discussions. So Viswanatha Satyanarayana writes about this comparison between multiple civilizations, and he says that in their Nagarikata, which means the Western Nagarikata, military technology is predominant. So all of their power emerged from military technology, and they also were very good with communication technology, transportation technology, and all of that. So now when we are let's say talking about the Bharatiya sort of a model, what do we do? Do we just reject technology? We cannot. It has national security implications. So we can't reject everything there, but we can't also adopt everything there. So what is it that we need to let go of in our parampara? What is it that we need to adopt from outside? These are all dialogues that the character of Vallabhbhai Patel has in that novel. So I think this is again very relevant to our current context, because we are essentially pretty much, I don't think much has changed on this matter from 1950 to now. We are still stuck in the same mold, where we are trying to understand what does it mean to have a society and a country that runs based on Bharatiya Jñāna Paramparā. So I think that's where some of these discussions from Viswanatha Satyanarayana's works are quite relevant. So again here he says that, so this is broadly a criticism of some of the construct of the Constitutional Assembly. But I'm glad that Vikramjit Banerjee ji, when he spoke in the morning, he also spoke about how some of the lawyers and all, they were so conversant with the like the Western thinkers and not as conversant with the Indian thinking. So here Viswanatha Satyanarayana again writes about how the kind of constructs that we used in constitutional policy in terms of law, in terms of curriculum, in terms of the broad education space, there's like barely anything Indian in it. We just copy pasted whatever the colonizer left to us, and he questions how is that independent thinking and what is Indian about it, so on. So it's very interesting that this is still valid to the current day as well, and it's a bit of a detour from this topic though. So recently I think there was this podcast on one of Bharatiya Dutt's channels where somebody was analyzing Narendra Modi's podcast that he gave to one of the Western podcasters. And there is a journalist, I think his name was Sugata Srinivasa Raju. He makes this remark that Modi is not somebody who quotes Burton and Russell. So he has that sort of a picture that an intellectual or a scholar should be somebody who reads a lot of texts and who quotes a European scholar. And it is that very tendency that Viswanatha Satyanarayana is criticizing throughout his works, and specifically in these kind of works, that why is it that you're always looking for a Western validation? And the fact that even after like 75 to 80 years of independence, we are still looking at, oh, he didn't quote about Burton and Russell, is he an intellectual? So that's still the mental frame in which a lot of us are operating. And I think that's sort of the frame that somebody like Viswanatha Satyanarayana questioned a lot. Now, again, the other piece that he questions a lot is that there is also this whole thing called a humanism or one human culture sort of thing that came as a part of this epoch, where the uniqueness of each culture was being questioned, that after all we are all humans, why can't we all have the same customs? Let us all be one, let us all, it's a distortion of the Ekam Sat Vipra Bahudha Vadanti sort of a mold, where now all the uniquenesses and specialties or those defining qualities of each cultures are being erased in the name of this global one world culture or one human culture kind of thing. And that is again something Viswanatha criticizes a lot, saying that differences are natural and differences in cultures are also natural, and he tries to argue that Bharatiya Sanskriti has to mean something, and Sanskriti in Egypt has to mean something, something else somewhere else has to mean something. You cannot say that a Christian culture is same as a Hindu culture. You cannot say that a Hindu culture is same as a Islamic culture. You have to differentiate yourself from others, and that essentially is what differentiates you as a jati. So when jati is used in the traditional sense, it is essentially about something that uniquely differentiates you from the other. So he talks about what is Bharata Jati and what is this Bharata Jati's Vangmaya, which is what does it actually stand for, what does it mean. And that's where again a lot of this whole IKS versus WKS thing comes into picture, that who are we, like what we really are. And answering that question is again something Viswanatha Satyanarayana's literature is very helpful. Now, a brief point on what I just mentioned on this military technology, communication technology, all of that, right? So, Viswanatha acknowledges that material prosperity is something that they had, and it might have been an exploitative model. Like colonialism was perhaps a feature and not a bug for that model. But what he tries to emphasize is that the Indian model is essentially about two things, which is Ahikam and Amushmikam both. Ahikam is essentially the material world, this world. Amushmikam is that world which is transcendental, spiritual, paraloka and all of that. So the way our systems were built is that it didn't say that you have to give up everything in the material plane. It said in the Ahika world, you need to have a sense of sufficiency or enough. So it is a model that is built at sufficiency on the Ahika world, and it focused more and more on the Amushmika world, which is that's where your devatas, your upasanas, karma, dharma, all of this comes in. And then he says that what happened in this epoch is that we are encountering a system which says Amushmikam doesn't exist. It's only Ahika, which means it's only a material. So that is the thing that he combats, that when you are letting go of what is distinctly differentiating you, you are essentially letting go of the whole Amushmika space and then succumbing to just being a materialistic, consumeristic sort of a creature. And there again, just to differentiate, that there are of course some in today's context who acknowledge this Amushmikam, but they put that strictly to the personal space, which means you do your sadhana, you do your meditation, but leave the rest of the space to the Western paradigm. But that's not what somebody like Viswanatha Satyanarayana says. He says that this whole construct of Amushmikam and Ahikam, and of prioritizing the Amushmika over excesses in the Ahika plane, that is what defines everything you do. That is what defines your law, that is what defines your constitution, that is what defines your arts, that is what defines your education, literature, everything else. So he is trying to say that is what is the innate Bharatiya quality which we should not let go of. So when we are talking about the IKS and Bharatiya Jñāna Paramparā space, I think it's not going to be a smooth journey. We have to confront these questions. It is not going to be like a happy marriage between a system that says just do INDICA and this system which says Amushmika should score over INDICA. So it's not going to be a smooth journey. So at some point you'll have to confront this. It's not going to be something where we can say that it's like saying, yeah, you can also follow Marx, you can also follow capitalism, you can also do this, you can also do that. At some point you'll have to acknowledge that there's only space for so many things. Now, the other piece that I'd like to briefly touch upon is from this other novel of his called Devatala Yuddham. So, Devata Yuddham, I hope you all can understand. That's essentially, it's like a fight between Devatas or fight of Devatas. So in that he makes a lot of references to these tens of reform movements that came in the 20th century, where you may have, like I think Advait was talking about somebody who's against idol worship. So we had, let's say, the Brahma Samaj, which had a certain conception. We had Arya Samaj, which had a certain conception. So a lot of these reform movements came up in the colonial epoch, and each of that had its own peculiarities. So Viswanatha Satyanarayana writes about some of these, which he says is prarthana matams. So these prarthana matams say we do only prayer, we don't want anything else. Like we don't want your varnashrama, we don't want your smritis, we don't want your shastras, we'll just do prayer. So that's again something that is molded more on the Abrahamic side than on the dharmic side. And then he talks about some of these sects which say, I accept Upanishads, but in Upanishads I accept only this part which is about Jnana, or I like the speculative philosophy aspect of Upanishads, but I don't get to pull me into the Upasana part of Upanishads. So he criticizes all of those as well, that this idea that you want to compartmentalize, saying I'll do only this but not that, all of these have consequences. And he says these will have consequences in how your families run, this will have consequences in how your society runs, this will have consequences in terms of how your relation with ecology, economy and all of that. So I think this is something that I don't think a lot of us in the IKS and the Bharatiya Jñāna Paramparā space understand as much, that it's like a worldview altering thing. It's not something which is like wearing a red shirt and wearing a black shirt sort of thing. It's a totally paradigm altering kind of a shift. And that is something that Viswanatha talks about a lot. And then when he talks about these sects, he also talks about how some of these, they only have this kind of a disdain or excessive criticism only for their own tradition. So they do this all only for the Hinduism, but they'll openly embrace, let's say, a prophet from another religion, and they say, but he is good, we don't mind following his teachings. But when you bring up your own devatas, your own shastras, that's when this whole pratikriya bhavam sort of comes back again. So he criticizes that. And I think that is a reading on this, a lot of these reform movements of the 20th century, which we have not done enough, because a lot of that literature is not even available. In fact, I use some of these modern day LLMs a lot. I was trying to ask these questions to Grok, ChatGPT and Google Gemini on some of these kind of thinkers who took the conservative stance and who were trying to question these reformist currents of this era. And let's say if you ask this question about Kerala, Grok actually told me that I don't have any reference to anybody from the conservative side on Kerala, because these things are just not represented in the popular media spaces. And the same applies to Viswanatha Satyanarayana as well. A lot of his work is in Telugu and Hindi. Pranav, who is sitting here, he has translated a couple of novels of Viswanatha Satyanarayana. One of them is published. So there is a lot of that work also that needs to be done in the current context. That a lot of this content is really in the Indian languages, and it is not there in the English sort of spaces. And a lot of power politics, knowledge politics is running in English, and we also have that as an honors on her too. So if we are anyway going to adopt the foreigner's language, we should at least make our best efforts to Indianize that language. So we cannot do a blind adoption like what we did in the last 60, 70 years. We need to also Indianize English as much as we can. And that is where I think some of Viswanatha Satyanarayana's work is quite helpful. So I'll just try to conclude quickly by trying to draw some attention onto some of these thought currents that are seen in Viswanatha's work. So he talks about this thing that he says that ee deshaniki oka vichitramaina ardhika vyuham. Ardhika vyuham is essentially like it's like a sinister economic scheme that has taken over this country, where this conflict between dharma and jivika has come up, where livelihood pursuit and dharma are at odds with each other. So if you take that route, you have to let go of this route. So he says that because of that schism that has come between jivika and dharma, we have become like this, where we have a kind of a hate and disdain for Purva Sampradayam, which means tradition, Purva Acharam, which means your customs, and then Purva Samstalu, which means all of these systems and ways of life that we had, and also Devatalu. So we have become very critical about our own. Some of the Western conservative thinkers today call this oikophobia, which means essentially you have this hate for home culture. So there is a lot that is happening in the past few years on the Western right wing as well, where they are trying to question their own oikophobic mindset, which means why do you hate your own culture so much and then start loving other cultures for everything and everything? So I think that is where I think somebody like Viswanatha Satyanarayana's work is very helpful, because he was very rooted and he didn't have this kind of a shame and guilt about his own culture. And a lot of us, I think, have been like in the last 70, 80 years, maybe like 3 generations, have been fed on a lot of this reformist sort of a literature, where we have this whole indifference, hate and disdain for our own cultures, and even some sort of a rebellious attitude on our own cultures, that has become like our mainstream, and it's almost like reform is a tradition, and we don't have a tradition itself that we can speak of. We have just imbibed that reformist mindset far too much, and Viswanatha Satyanarayana's work really help in trying to counter that. So I'll just quickly end by talking about one last work of his, which again is important in the context of this whole Bharatiya Jñāna Paramparā discussion. So this work is called Nadulu, which is a work about 6 river civilizations. So like every civilization broadly is built around a river, right? So you have this is a work which is about a Greek civilization, Egyptian civilization, Bharatiya civilization and all of that. So here he talks about what again changed in this colonial epoch. And that's where this whole discussion around Aryan invasion theory or Aryan migration theory, out of India theory, all of that which we have today, that comes back here, that this whole idea that somebody called Aryas came from, let's say, the Arctic or some other place, and then they came here, they brought their culture. This, he says, is something that was, it never had a parallel in, let's say, anything before the colonial epoch, and he is very critical of that why is it that we have to get into that debate and then try to explain. I am saying from my traditional standpoint that I don't even want to entertain that as a question, and that's where he questions that my sources are my Puranas, Vedas and Smritis, and you cannot say that I'll reject those sources and I'll only take the sources that the Indologist says. You should also engage with me. So that's where I think when we are talking again about IKS, some of these become important, that what does it mean that if you adopt, let's say, an Aryan invasion sort of a discourse, how does that impact in terms of how you perceive your own tradition, how you build your society and all of that? And why is it that some of these traditionalists continue to emphasize that the roots of this Bharatiya Sanskriti lay on this land, and Bharata Varsha is what they continue to emphasize on. So all of these ideas have consequences. So essentially, we need to understand that why is it that this idea is important? Why is it that this idea became important only in the colonial epoch? Why is it that this idea is now weaponized by certain pockets? Why is it that, let's say, it didn't show up in 15th century? Why didn't it show up in the 14th century? So on. So I think that's again a very important thought stream that you would find in Viswanatha's works, particularly in Nadulu. Another part that he has written multiple works on this. This is again this whole, what I call, let's say, like the tyranny of chronology. So he talks about this again, that when the Indologists, the missionaries sort of a discourse took over narrating our past, they were trying very hard to put our discourse into, let's say, the 4000 year BC sort of a time frame, because they wanted to align with the Christian theory of creation and its dates. Now, a lot of Hindu historians jumped into it, and he's writing about this in 50s and 60s. So he's not even talking about today's historians. He's writing about then, that why did we have to jump into that suddenly without even understanding the politics of chronology? And why do we have to get into this game of saying that Rama was born in this age, Krishna was born in this age? And in fact, recently I've read one piece. I mean, I respect the scholar, but there was this which said the Skanda and Kartikeya was born in 10,000 BC. And where do we stop? We cannot get into this business of trying to date every single god and every single event. In fact, there are some who have gone ahead and put a date for Shiva, saying Shiva has come 15,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, all of that. So I think this is what Viswanatha Satyanarayana contests in this novel, where he says that you need to understand the politics of chronology. And very interestingly, today, in scholars who are trying to understand decolonization and sense of time and all of that, there's a lot of debate going around, do we really have to succumb to this linear historical time? There is cyclical time, there is indigenous time. If you read some of the literature in, let's say, places like Australia, where they are trying to understand the indigenous time, they are talking about deep time, they are talking about all these concepts which were essentially baked in our things from the start in day one. It was not like we didn't have a sense of time. We don't say that like a particular avatar happened, it could have happened in any yuga and all of that. Right? We do have a sequence. We say that this happened in this yuga, then this came, then. So we do have a sense of chronology, but it need not get into this sense of dating. And also we need not obsess over dating everything. So Viswanatha himself, while he contested this kind of dating game, he was somebody who really batted for the right dating for Mahabharata and all of that. So there is a time and space for all of these things that you need not obsess over, like trying to chronologize everything and anything, and then saying that unless something is chronologized and put a date, it is not truth, otherwise it is untruth. So that is the attitude that he tries to contest, and he says that this is something that is very unique to this epoch. We never were like this before, and a lot of Indians unnecessarily jumped into this without this critical examination of this sense of time. And again, just to close in terms of where I started, so Viswanatha again here talks about Bharatiya Nagarikata, and he says that our Nagarikata was based on multiple values. So you have this value called Atithyam, which is hospitality. You have a value called Audaryam, which is generosity. You have a value called Dakshinyam, which is kindness. And then you have Dharmam, Satyam, Ahimsa, Shanti, Danti. Danti is restraint, Shanti is peace, or that sort of a thing. So you have all these values, and we are saying civilization is where all these four values flourish, or these four values sort of drive the way of life of the people. And then you have this new model which says atom bomb based civilization. So he is writing in the 50s, so obviously he is talking about the politics then. In today's context, maybe we are saying LLM is the civilization, Gen AI is civilization. So he is contesting this narrative that while technological superiority and techniques, they have a place, you need not succumb to it so much that you ignore everything else that are important for a civilization, and then you totally go there and saying that unless you are technologically superior, that is like the defining value of civilization. Again, he's not saying you should diverse from technology either. So he is acknowledging that it's important for geopolitics, it's important for national sovereignty and all of that. But there is like contours that you have to put for this space. In fact, there is this quip in one of these conversations that he has in these books, where one character says to the other that it is your misfortune that you are born in India. Had you born as a dog in Russia, you would have purposed gone to the space. So he also has that sort of a cheeky humor baked in. I think that's broadly where that I want to end this, that we need to understand what are the values that define the Bharatiya Nagarikata, what is the value that define who we are. We need to understand what the Jati Lakshanam is. So Viswanatha uses the word Jati Lakshanam. So here Jati is the Bharata Jati. So what is it that uniquely identifies this Jati? And then we have to build our knowledge systems, and everything needs to be aligned towards that. So your Jati Lakshana is what defines your religion, that is what defines your Sangha Vyavastha, that is what defines your curriculum and all of that. And on Viswanatha continues to emphasize on the same through his books. So like I spoke at the early part of this talk, you have this notion of karma, you have this notion of prarabdha, you have this notion of janma. So a society that believes in purarjanma will act in a certain way. A society that believes in you only live once will act in a certain way. So when you are talking about a Jnana Parampara, you will have to say that my Jnana Parampara is anchored on these values. You cannot say that I am agnostic. Like you cannot say whether you believe in janma or not, it is okay. Whether you believe in karma or not, it is okay. These are like foundational values that define everything else downstream. And Viswanatha in his own works, when he is trying to define what Bharata Jati is, he tries to emphasize on all of these. So he says that our foundations are in Vedas, in Shastras and Puranas. So we cannot run away from those and then try to define a new Bharatiya Jñāna Paramparā. When we are saying it is Bharatiya Jñāna Paramparā, we will have to anchor it back again onto Vedas, Shastras and Puranas, and we have to understand what changed in this epoch and try to like re-anchor ourselves into like our own sacred traditions. So I think that's where I'd like to end this talk. Thanks to INDICA and thanks to Dr. Nagaraj Paturi for giving me this opportunity. And As I just mentioned, Pranav has translated one of the works of Viswanatha into English, and there's also, I think, the Hindi translation is also available in some of the portals. So I think if some of you are interested, you can definitely check that out. And for people from the Telugu land who are interested into these spaces, I think the onus is on us to translate some of this work back into English, because a lot of the Indian society, I think there's a lot of craving for understanding Indian knowledge systems these days, and some of these voices are like the most rooted and authentic voices that can help us understand who we are. So yeah, that's where I'd like to end. So thanks to INDICA for giving me this opportunity. Yeah, thank you.
Dhanyavad Hari ji. I have recently started reading Vishwanatha Garu's works, Ha Ha Hu Hu and all. So, but I'm really tempted to learn Telugu and read his works which are yet untranslated. Or maybe I can urge you and your fellow co-travelers to maybe translate it and make this aspect also very well known and widely known across the country. Thank you so much. This special talk really meant, it packed so much, it will take time to reflect upon it.